Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Fiorino. I'm Director of the Center for Environmental Policy at American University School of Public Affairs. Very happy to welcome you to our session today. The Center for Environmental Policy is focused very much on improving environmental governance in the United States, and we hope around the world. So we're going to look on a more worldly basis today. So we have a program today on positive psychology, population, and sustainability. And this goes back a few years. My friend Dorit, Kerret, who is one of our speakers today, organized a conference, and Alon was there, on positive psychology and sustainability. And when I saw their recent paper on population, I thought this would be something worth bringing to the attention of our community. So welcome. I will briefly introduce our three speakers and our format, and then I will turn it over to Alon and Dorit. So Alon is Professor and Chair of the Department of Public Policy at Tel Aviv University. Many of you may have read Alon's works on Israeli environment. He's a leading environmental activist in Israel, as well as a leading scholar, and now with the university. So welcome, Alon. Dorit Kerret is a senior lecturer in the Department of Public Policy at Tel Aviv University. And Dorit has done quite a range of really outstanding scholarship on sustainability issues. So this is, I think, a creative application in terms of positive psychology. And our third panelist today is Michael Kraft. Michael is Professor of Political Science and Public Affairs Emeritus and the Herbert Fisk-Johnson Professor of Environmental Studies Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay. Michael has written on just about every environmental and sustainability topic imaginable, and we're very pleased to have him with us today. So we will hear a presentation on positive sustainability, and positive psychology and sustainability. We will have a discussion among ourselves with our panel, and then we'll open this up to questions from our audience. And if you would like to submit questions, you can do it through the question and answer function on Zoom. So with that, I will turn this over to Alon from Tel Aviv University. Alon.
Thanks so much, Dan. It is really an honor to be here with you in this forum and to share the stage with Michael Kraft, who's of course one of the leading figures for years now in environmental policy, and Dan himself, who's sort of a giant in the field. I myself, when I finished my doctorate, I wanted to do anything but be an academic and a researcher. And so I started an organization called the Israel Union for Environmental Defense, which was basically a NRDC wannabe. We wanted to emulate that culture of legal advocacy. And we were young and we sued anything that moved. We had a lot of success. We stopped polluters of the air, and we managed to enjoin building on the coastline and all kinds of successes. But at some point I stopped and realized that although we had all kinds of small victories, in the big picture we were losing. And I realized that maybe what was going on was that as Israel became perhaps the most crowded Western country in the world, if you look at where people actually live, we were actually dealing with symptoms. And the real problem was that we were facing unbearable population density. We had to do something about it. Well, a few years went by. I found myself on sabbatical writing a book about forests at Stanford University, next door to Paul Ehrlich was where they put me. And Paul Ehrlich, of course, wrote The Population Bomb in 1968, which really got the environmental movement thinking about this. And as I became more and more friendly with Paul, who was about as old as my father, but he thinks still much, much younger than all the rest of us, I began to realize that I had to devote my attention to that, and came back here later and wrote a book called The Land is Full, where I really tried to look at this issue of population. And when I got back, the book won a prize, and I ran around Israel trying to make this case that we have to address overpopulation, or otherwise we will not managed to overcome Israel's environmental problems. And I talked about collapsing ecosystems and loss of open spaces and the spiraling ever higher greenhouse gases. And I did, I think, a very, very passionate job. But at some point, my very good colleague from the Department of Public Policy, Dorit, Kerret, politely, because she was once my doctoral student, but with great respect, told me, Alon, you have to recognize that when you go around and tell everybody that the overpopulation is so disastrous and that everything is collapsing, you aren't necessarily creating conditions for success. In fact, you are paralyzing people by presenting all these bad news and not offering a positive, constructive route forward. Maybe you want to read a little bit of the literature about positive psychology, which has so informed my research. And I did, and I attended the workshop that Dan spoke about and started some early ideas, which ended up in a paper which recently was published. And so I want to thank Dorit for sort of showing me the positive way forward on this. And she's going to take you through some of the major findings that we felt should inform the efforts as we try to convince people that are living in countries where there are high fertility rates to maybe move in a more sustainable direction and recognize that the notion of infinite growth in a closed system is really quite an oxymoron. It can't be done. And yet perhaps we can bring these unsustainable trends in terms of fertility to something which will be more in balance with nature. So Dorit, why don't you take it from here? And I'm sure people will be delighted to hear your presentation.
Thank you, Alon and Dan, and I'm so excited to be here. Dan, I don't remember if I told you that, but when I was writing my thesis in 1999, when Alon was my advisor on policy tools, then your paper, your Harvard Law Review paper on environmental law just came out and made really a lot of sense and order in all the mess that I was reading. And ever since, whenever I switched to a different topic and I thought I was being really creative and finding a new field, the seminal paper that made everything organized and understandable was yours, like a comparative environmental policy of countries, and then the sustainable growth, which has a lot in common with positive demography, a positive sustainability that I'm going to talk about today. And then when you invited Michael Kraft to join us as a panelist today, I said, oh my God, his work inspired me so much on my research on policy tools, especially on the TRI and the disclosure regulation that I researched for a while. So it's really a great pleasure to be here. And I'm gonna use the share screen with you for just a second to show you the topic of our talk today. And okay, I hope you can, I hope everyone can see this, the screen. And the talk today, as Alon mentioned, is based on the paper we wrote together. And the paper is very extensive. And whoever is interested in the many examples that we have there from many different countries is invited to read the full paper. And I'm going to just go really briefly through the paper today. So I'll start with a riddle, just to get you into the atmosphere of what's going on in Israel in terms of how many children you're supposed to have. And I have 2 kids. I would have shown you a picture, but I didn't have their consent to show you the pictures. So I'm just going to talk about their names. And in Israel, if you don't have at least 3 children, even in the secular sector, when if you're not religious, then people ask you all the time about your 3rd child. So I came up with a story because my eldest daughter, she's called Mayan. In Hebrew, it's translated to spring, to water spring in English. And then my youngest kid, his name is Aviv, which is translated to spring, the season. So I tell people I can't have a 3rd child because I'm not going to call him Kfitz, which is the 3rd word for spring in Hebrew. So today we're going to talk about how do we promote two-child families. And as Alon said, the traditional way was to show people all the bad consequences, all the bad environmental consequences from overpopulation. But we wanted to show a different approach to convincing people to have two children, because basically, ultimately, it's a personal decision how many kids you're going to have, and no matter how we're going to tell people about the state of the environment, ultimately, it's how their life is going to be. And what we'll use today and in the paper is an approach that is called positive sustainability. And I developed it with my colleague, Professor Tami Ronen, who is a positive psychologist. And basically, it's a combination of positive psychology and environmental policy. And my guess is that you know a lot about environmental policy. So I want to say just a few words about positive psychology. And usually, when people have to imagine what positive psychology is, they picture this picture, Sleeping Beauty, and the prince is going and coming to save her, and they live happily ever after. But, well, this is not what positive psychology is about. It is more like, if we want to relate to movies, so it's more like Wonder Woman. She's resilient, she faces many challenges, and she needs even disasters, and she uses her strength, her powers to confront it, and she makes the best of any situation. Positive psychology is also about directly promoting well-being. In traditional psychology, you cure mental illness, which is also promoting well-being, but it's not directly promoting well-being. It's more like, if we go to the analogy of gardening, if you want to have you want to grow tomatoes, and you take out all the seeds in your gardens, will you have tomatoes growing? So the answer is basically no, because you need to plant tomatoes in order to have tomatoes. So positive psychology is based on this notion that you have to also grow the things that you want to have, and not only take out things that you don't want to have. And today we're going to talk about 3 topics related to demography in this sense. One is to directly promote what we want to promote. The second is convergence, how the individual well-being is connected to the collective well-being. And the third is offering you a change theory, how we want to, how we're going to use theories from positive psychology to change behavior. And I want to start with the convergence. Convergence means that if we're talking about demography, the notion is that having 2 children and not more is good both for your individual well-being, for your family well-being, and for the collective well-being. And here I want to mention Professor Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel laureate. He won his Nobel Prize for showing us that people don't think like in an economically rational way. And one of the biases that he mentions is the focus bias. When we think about one thing, we focus only on that thing, and we tend to forget that life is comprised of many, many different aspects. And in our talk, I'm talking about our subjective well-being and children. Sometimes when people think about having an additional child, like a 3rd or 4th or 9th child, they think about their firstborn, their baby, and they focus on all the wonderful, amazing things that the baby brought with him or her, and how amazing the experience was. And they forget that life is comprised of many, many different aspects. And if we talk about the concept of overall well-being in your life, we see that there are different various models, but each of them talks about different components of well-being. There is not just one thing that your well-being is based on. And one of the two important aspects of well-being, one is relationships with other people, and one is balance, the whole balance in your life. And when we look into literature about parents' well-being, we see that there are different aspects, different variables that increase parents' well-being and different aspects that reduce parents' well-being. And some are related to meaning, basic needs, positive emotions, and social roles, which increase well-being, and negative emotions, economic problems, lack of sleep, and in particular, marital problems, they reduce parents' well-being. And if we look into the common denominator of all these factors, we can see that they're all related to the number of children that one has. And if we go into the literature specifically regarding the number of children, we see that there are several factors that are directly related to the number of children, like the stress, the levels of stress of the parents. When they spend time with their children, it becomes higher when you have more children. School problems increase with the number of children, and also violence of the children and within the family. If you want to, and other aspects that decrease with the number of children are the connection with adult children. The less children you have, the better connection you have with them when they're older. Privacy and space shrinks with the number of children. And also, very naturally, the time that is devoted to each child, which is in turn related to many different aspects of well-being of the parents and the children, like school achievements, reading, the children's subjective well-being, their skills and their risk behavior in adolescence, and many other issues. In particular, I would like to mention relationship with a spouse, which has a robust research on its contribution to your overall well-being and its negative relationship with the number of children. Basically, all these aspects are related to trade-off between the time that you have for the children and for your life and for the other aspects of your life, for your spouse, for other aspects of your well-being, and the number of children. So basically, if I want to sum up this topic, I would say that having two-child family is at least a good option for the individuals, for the well-being of the children themselves, for the well-being of the parents, for the well-being of the family as a whole, for their relationship, and of course, for the vice versa. So it's a win-win situation. So this is one, the convergence. And now we turn to the question, how can countries promote two-child families? And in the paper, we have many different examples of states that try to promote two-child families and have a demographic policy. And we take from there the aspects that are specifically related to positive psychology. And here I want to talk about directly promoting and the examples you can see in the paper. So I talked about before how in general, positive psychology is aimed at directly promoting well-being. And as I mentioned with gardening, that we want to plant the seeds, when we want to directly promote two-child families, we can promote various aspects. And we saw that in countries that had demographic policies, they try to promote many different aspects that are not specifically demographic policy, not telling you how many children you have, but they try to promote women's career, women education, children education, the relationship within the family. All these things that you promote directly are related later to the number of children people are going to have, and particularly within fertility clinics, they offer the families hope and specific solutions for whoever wants to have two-child families, and they explain the benefits of having two-child families to the people. And I want to end with the third topic today, taken from the positive approach that we can use in demography, which is change theory. These principles are borrowed from CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, from researchers called Kerret and Professor Tammy Ronen, who also developed these principles. And there are 6 thinking rules that we can think when we want to promote a specific policy, and we can use them in order to have behavior change. So the first rule, we call it think behavior. And we mean that you can describe things that happen in the world in terms of actions and not necessarily situations. For instance, if we talk about demography, we can talk about overpopulation. Overpopulation is a situation. It is very hard, very difficult to see as an individual what you can do about overpopulation. It's overwhelming, it's big, and it's a situation. It seems like it's a fixed situation. We want to turn the discourse into discourse of actions. What can be done? Because action can be changed. And problems are, even the largest problems are caused by actions. So the action in this regard is plan your family. Instead of talking about overpopulation, let's talk about how you can plan your own family. Then we transfer the responsibility to the individual level. The second principle is think solution. It means that sometimes, many times, as environmentalists, we like to talk about problems. We like to talk about their causes, their roots. And here we offer to change the discourse and talk about the solutions. We want to talk about the outcomes and how they can be promoted. Instead of brainstorming, we want to give people contraceptives, for instance. And then if we have major, incredible, big goals, it's sometimes very difficult to think how you're gonna deal with these goals. So we want to divide it into small steps. And even if we want to sell people the idea that they will have better lives, better well-being, if they have 2 children and not many, many children, then if we sell them ultimate happiness, it seems like an unachievable goal and it's too big. We need to divide it into gradual improvement, into concrete gradual steps, like improving familial relationship, and give specific actions that you can take in order to achieve it. And then the fourth is really related to what we talked about in the convergence section, that you have to think positive. So instead of talking about the disadvantages of large families, we'll talk about the benefits of having small family, like having more time with your children, better relationship with each child, better relationship with your spouse, better relationship in your family as a whole, better future for your children. And here we want to focus on strength and hope, which sometimes we even divide into a different rule because it is so important, how we can use our own strengths in order to achieve the goal. The fifth rule is think flexible. It means that if we're fixed on only having one route to lead us to our goal, we might be stuck, because if you have an obstacle that we can't go around, then we're stuck. Our goal is can't be achieved. And here we say, let's think flexible. If we don't have one path that we can achieve what we want to achieve, our goal, then we'll take another path. If we have an obstacle, then we think about ways to overcome it. To plan around it, to find alternative routes. So if people think that many children will bring their happiness, will bring them happiness, and this is the reason that they want to have many children, we can think about many ways to improve well-being, not just one. So you can do many other things in order to improve your well-being. You don't necessarily have to have more children. And the last rule is think about the future. Instead of dwelling on the past, we want to think forward. We want to extend past successes, and we want to think what we can do to improve our situation. Instead of thinking about why did I not spend enough time with my children, I'm gonna think about right now how I can improve my family relationship. So we talked about 3 different venues that the positive approach can enrich demographic policy. One was directly promoting what we want to promote. We can directly promote women, women's education, women's career, children's health, children education. Whatever goals we want to promote, we can promote it directly. We can directly promote 2-child families. We talked about convergence and having 2 children as a good option for a good life, a good option for the well-being of the individual and the well-being of the society. And we ended with talking about change theory, how we can use those rules in order to enrich the policy discourse and to offer a route for changing individuals' behavior. So thank you very much for your attention. And I think I'm a little bit over my 15 minutes. So.
Excellent, Dorit. That was very interesting. And I think it gives us an approach to these issues. And there are a number of things to talk about. But we asked Michael Kraft to give us some perspective and some comments. And then I have a couple questions I want to raise with the group before we take general questions. So Michael? You may be on. Yeah, so something happened with the sound, Michael. Not sure. So maybe we can go into our discussion and hope we can get the sound question resolved from your perspective. So I hope we'll be able to hear from you soon. But why don't we start off with Dorit and Alon. So one thought I had about this is there are a lot of approaches that I think were developed in the context of developed countries, more the richer economies. And a lot of the population pressures, of course, are in countries that are much earlier in the growth process. So just, could we get your thoughts on the differences between developed countries, Israel, the US, Western Europe, and so on, and countries that are much earlier phase of growth? So any thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, I think that it's fairly self-evident that the economic calculus of having children is very different in different kinds of society. Mm-hmm. One of the most fundamental, almost axiomatic theories within demography is this notion of a transition, a population transition, where almost all societies originally started off with high birth rates, but high death rates. But then eventually the death rates began to drop and we had a population bomb. And then at some point, the birth rates also began to come down. And that happened in many cases because agrarian societies where it made a lot of sense to have a lot of children who were working hands and were sort of a social security policy, having more children was an economically rational policy. So there are still many societies, particularly in Africa and other less developed worlds, where that equation still has to be addressed. And it's very hard to make the case. But I would argue, first of all, that people around the world are largely the same. That's been my experience. I've spent time in Africa. I've been in lots of different countries in the world. And I feel that when we look at the data with regard to happiness amongst families, it's the same in Nigeria, it's the same in South Africa, and it's the same in the US. So I think that we can make that case. And what we find also is that when developing countries have successful family planning programs, they go about it by convincing people this is going to be good for you. They don't tell people, you know, there's a real problem with climate change, and if you have more children, you're going to be increasing their carbon footprint. You're not going to tell them, my gosh, we're watching our hemorrhaging species here. That people might identify with on an abstract level. No, but if you tell them this way, your children will get an education, get ahead, you could actually make a better case. And the last point I'd like to make is that it is true that Europe has populations which are shrinking and having low birth rates, but many Western countries, including the US, and particularly places like Australia, are growing. Now they're growing because of immigration, more than they are growing because of high fertility rates. But there are many, I think, very, very thoughtful environmentalists who are concerned about the rate of population growth in developed countries as well as developing countries. It's not just a issue which poor countries need to think about. That's certainly true in Israel, but I think it's true in many other countries as well.
Okay, Dorit, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, well, I think that Alon basically covered all the whole topic.
Okay, yeah, I like the point that people are similar everywhere. Circumstances may vary, but a lot of the motivations and certainly people's goals in life may be similar. So Michael, are you, right, we still don't hear you, Michael, so we'll continue. So I was also interested in what this means for public policy measures like tax policy or housing policy or educational policy. Because you made a good case that sort of get people to understand the links between individual well-being and societal well-being and capacities of the planet and ecosystems and those kinds of issues. So it was much more about
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're on, Michael.
Well, now you can hear me. I don't know what went wrong. Yeah. I mean, all I did was unmute, so you can see me and hear me.
We see you and hear you now, so we'll hold my question. Okay. And why don't we get your comments, Michael?
All right, let's do this before we lose.
Yes, right. Well, we got it.
Once again. Well, okay, so what I started to say, but obviously wasn't being recorded and no one can hear us, I really love the paper because of the positive spin it put on what has long been a very contentious issue. So people pose a population problem and say, but we have to control the population, or we have to get people to do what they're not doing. This approach by Dorit and Alon turns that around and says, look, it's really in people's own interest to do this, but they hear conflicting messages. They hear that the country, from some accounts, is running out of people or running out of a labor force, particularly in developed countries. Conservative political commentators in particular, Ben Wattenberg, I recall years ago, talked about the birth dearth, kind of a catchy but meaningless phrase. We don't have a shortage of people. And what I wanted to do was, because we haven't mentioned any numbers yet, so I went to the census.gov page. This is not the one for filling out the census, but the regular census. And there's a population clock there for both the US and the world. So it had the US this morning at 330.262 million. 330.62. That's right now in 2020. For the year 2025, it projects a US population of 362. And by 2050, that's only 30 years away, 286. So for a country that thinks it has no population problem and that we're not growing or not growing fast enough, that's 56 million more people in 30 years. That's more than another California and a half. And the global picture is even more striking. So, and with the Census Bureau, and you can see this elsewhere, the population clock, that as the runs through the numbers, we're adding roughly 2 to 3 people every second. You can see the clock moving. It has the population this morning at 7.679 billion. By 2035, that's 8.9, from 7.7, let's say, to 8.9, and by 2050 up to 9.8. As I always used to tell my students, those numbers don't mean a lot because they still seem, 9.8 seems like a small number, even if it's billions of people. So for the world growth, that's 86 million people per year, or even more striking. That's 230,000 people every day. 230,000 is roughly the metro area size of Green Bay, Wisconsin. That's all of Brown County, Wisconsin. That's another whole Brown County, Wisconsin every day in the world. But again, those are numbers. Numbers don't mean much, but you have to think in terms of what do people need? Well, they need food, they need transportation, they need housing, they need energy to heat and cool, they need jobs. Maybe the world can provide all of that, but the striking thing about population numbers like this, and Alon mentioned it initially in talking to Paul Ehrlich about his 1968 book, The Population Bomb. What this translates into is an enormous demand on the ecological resources of the world. Nobody has hard numbers on this, but there's clearly some maximum number of people the world can support. So as Dan put it in his book, we have a finite Earth, and a finite Earth, by definition, can't grow. We can use resources more efficiently. We can't develop new resources. And at some point, we reach a population that is simply too large to sustain over time without massive changes in, say, energy efficiency, technological developments, and so on. So that's the heart of the problem. There also is a divided world. As we have a divided demography or demographic variation that's considerable. For example, the UN says if you put all developed countries together, and the United States is the exception because we're still growing at roughly 0.5% per year. Most of Western Europe is not growing. Some countries are losing population. The United Nations says the average for developed countries is 0. Actually, it says 0.0. There's a little bit of growth, but it rounds out to 0.0. But less developed countries are at 1.4, but even that's misleading because if you subtract China, it's 1.6% a year. That's a lot. So again, the numbers I gave you are pretty striking. That's 250,000 per day being added to the world. So what it comes down to, Dorit sort of focus more on what we think about in developed countries, I think. How do we persuade ordinary people in rich developed countries to have smaller families? I guess I would say they're already having smaller families. The problem of course, we use more resources per person than other areas, but the real growth in numbers is in developing countries. And there the challenge is even greater, I think, than what we've been talking about so far, because you have really different perspectives on women's rights, on the value of children, on the male dominance in society, on cultural and religious values that make it very hard for people to say, gosh, I'd rather have only one child or 2 children and not 5 or 6. But that's not an easy decision for an individual woman to make in many countries. So what I loved about the paper again was insofar as you need to persuade people, whether developed countries or less developed countries, developing countries, to change their views this is absolutely the right approach, which you have to make it in their own interest. You don't harp on the need to do this. You don't tell people what to do. You say, would you like a better quality of life? Would you like healthier children? Would you like to make sure you have enough food and energy and housing? And you have a pleasant life for the time that we have. You need to put it in different terms depending on the context. What you say in England or France or Germany or the United States is not what you would say in many parts of the developing world. You have to put it in terms of the local cultural, religious, historical context. But I think, you know, what the paper says, and we've been summing up this morning, is there's a better way of approaching this than what has been argued traditionally and historically. You don't tell people you need to do this because the world depends on it. You put it in terms of, you should think about doing this because it's in your own interest to do it. Because you will have a better life. Your family will have a better life. We will all be better off, but you need to change the framework context in which we think about all these issues. So, you know, the numbers I cited, yeah, they're impressive and they drive home the nature of the problem. But when you get around to solutions, the paper is right on target in saying we need to think more in terms of how to deal with individuals in different situations around the world, about how to make a choice that they can live with, that they think is a smart choice for them and their state, their country, you know, and the world in terms of what we all face on the same finite planet. So that's enough. And I guess the microphone's still working, so we're lucky it didn't cut out.
We heard every word, Mike, and thank you for those thoughts. So why don't we jump right into some questions. So first one directed Alon and Dorit to discuss the impact on birth rates as it relates to the role of women in the workplace and how that is changing or should or could be changing.
I'll just say briefly that Gary Becker won the Nobel Prize for Economics. It was at the University of Chicago for some very, very important research about why it is that women who were wealthier and were seemingly more successful had fewer children. Malthus said otherwise. When Malthus was talking about overpopulation for the first time at the end of the 18th century, he expected that richer people would have more children because they can get married younger and they have better health care, but they found out otherwise. And his notion was that there's something that we would call opportunity cost, that women who have careers, who have some horizons in their life beyond just having children, realize that there is a trade-off. And I think Dorit directed that. And I think that that insight is something which we need to think about, that there's never been a country which has intentionally managed to lower the birth rate without giving women some sort of horizon professionally and providing them the opportunities to have another things. But let's hear, Dorit's a woman, she probably would know more about this than me.
Yeah, well, this is exactly the main point of directly promoting what we want to promote. So promoting other topics that there is a consensus on, like having women's education, women combined in the workforce. It's the consequence of this, the positive spillover, is having less children. So if a country wants to promote a successful demographic policy, whether it is in developing countries, and we saw many examples we analyzed in the paper of developing countries that use this strategy in order to address demographic policy. In order to have fewer children for each woman, the focus is giving women opportunities, careers, education. So Alon usually says that three ways for, you say it, because
well, there's three ways for us to promote sustainable population, and that's empower women, empower women, empower women.
Yeah,
The rest,
yeah.
that's a little commentary.
Yeah. That's certainly been a very, very important part of it. And there is this a little bit of a inverse relationship as economies develop. I know we can say grow, we can say develop. As they grow, I guess that birth rates even out. A lot of that relates to status of women and conditions and so on. So here's a question, very interesting question from one of my students. Aren't inequalities in power, wealth, and resources between countries more harmful to the environment than overpopulation? So the sort of the role of inequality of various kinds, I would add among countries, but also maybe within countries. So maybe, Mike, do you have thoughts on that? And we could look.
Yeah, sure. It's a common observation. I think that people in rich countries use a whole lot more resources and have a greater impact. I'm in the process of rewriting one of my texts, and I always come back to this point because the population problem historically, and back when Ehrlich was writing, and for much of the last 50 years, we tend to think, oh, and I even emphasize it in my comments, the population growth problem is in developing countries. But put in a larger ecological context, the population problem in terms of environmental impact is in rich countries because we live higher on the hog, so to speak. We live in bigger homes, we use more energy, we travel more, even if travel's down a bit during the pandemic. So it's absolutely understandable that people can say, no, the real population impact, not numbers of people, but the impact of the people we have is greater in rich countries. And in many, as Dan knows, we were finishing a new edition of the Vig and Kraft book, Environmental Policy. Rich Tobin's chapter, for those who know that, has all the numbers you would want on the differential impact of rich countries and poor countries on energy and oil consumption, among other energy sources, and housing and food. And to put it, bluntly, that people in rich countries live very, very well and therefore have a much greater impact per capita on the environment than is true of countries that have either a larger population or a higher growth rate, but that live much more modestly, barely, in some cases, barely at a sustainable level to maintain life. So that's clearly is a big issue, has been for a long time, which is why so many people resent the implication that the problem is in developing countries simply because they have a high rate of growth and not in terms of consumption levels, where developed countries clearly are the source of the problem.
Okay, Alon?
If I could just jump in to be a little bit provocative on this issue.
Yeah.
I remember at a lunch I asked Paul this question, when people come to you with this argument, it's consumption, it's not population. What's your response? And he said, well, look, we need to look at this as a rectangle, okay? We don't know if the long side of the rectangle is population in this thing, or if it is consumption. We know, though, that whether it's consumption or population, the area inside the rectangle stays the same. And I would argue that if you take a look, for example, of climate change, okay? When in 1992, when the United Nations Convention, Framework Convention on Climate Change was made, really the developing countries were only about 25% of the global carbon footprint. And it really didn't make sense to force them to start adopting ceilings on their greenhouse gases. But now, today, this is totally turned around.
Yeah.
And the vast majority, besides China and India rising, but even in a country like South Africa, we will not stabilize the global atmosphere if we don't bring on the developing countries. That was the shift in Paris when, for the first time, people were expected to submit their NDC, the developing countries. So yes, consumption is critical. We all need to reduce our ecological footprint, but let's not make that a reason to dismiss population. Both sides of the rectangle are critical.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. Yeah, as population growth, as economic growth occurs, then we may see, unless we can change the patterns, is really the key, a lot of the same sort of patterns of consumption in countries that are experiencing the larger population growth. So I like the rectangle. That's good. Here's an interesting question I'll direct to Dorit first, and then others if you want. Is there an example you can share of the use of positive psychology for demography that has worked? So do we have any good examples at any scale of positive psychology having an effect?
Yes, we do. Actually, all the examples that we analyzed, it was not purely only positive psychology, but it had many, many aspects. And one example is the PMC example, Population Media Center. They have uh, an, an, a, an amazing program of having audio shows for countries, for developing countries, and TV shows with drama shows, and they show the heroes of these drama shows are women, successful women with careers who have only a few children, and then you have the woman with a lot of children who suffers, and they show the different kinds of families, and using actually a very famous researcher in positive psychology, Bandura he's called, his theory, which is based on role models and building the competence and self-esteem of people through the media, and it was very successful in terms of showing the role model and reducing population in those countries. And also fertility clinics. Alon research, he talked to some people, so maybe he wants to add later from his personal experience with them, but they told him that the fertility clinics, in addition to offering contraceptives and family planning plans, they offer hope, basically, for the women. They offer education for the children, better health. They show him what can be done if they will have smaller families. So, and it was very effective. Do you want to add?
I think you summarized it. I'm sure there's other questions if you want. We can get back to that later.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it's always good to have positive examples when you're advocating an approach to solving a problem. So very good. Question from actually a member of our Center Advisory Board, Francis Frisnar. How is the concept of carrying capacity addressed in this conversation? So that gets into the finite Earth concept, and capacities of resources, ecosystems, and so on. So, Michael, did you want to start with that? Well, how does carrying capacity relate to this, or how would you relate it?
Well, as I was trying to explain, it isn't just population, it's population times consumption or some environmental measure of environmental impact. And clearly that's more important than just talking about population numbers. We used to have the old formula, the IPAT formula of population and affluence and technology all multiplied together. So if we could be more efficient at the energy, with the energy that we use, you could have a little higher population and still get the same result. If we count, looking forward, if we can count on major technological advances in reducing carbon output, for example. Just read a piece the other day of taking old industrial solid waste and have it absorb carbon dioxide that can then be used in construction materials. You're pulling CO2 out of the air. And ultimately, it's a matter of which approaches turn out to be the most feasible technologically and the cheapest. But that's another example of how it isn't just numbers of people, it's the technology we use, it's the level of affluence, as I was saying earlier. You can obviously the world, and there's been some speculation over time as to is there a maximum population for the world. The way I always approach that is it depends on how low you want to live on the
right.
If you want to live at a really, really low level, the population of the world maybe could reach, I've seen numbers as high as 15 billion people. On the other hand, if you want to live like we do in the United States or some do in Israel and Western Europe, it's going to be a whole lot less than 15 billion, we think. There's not a lot of people don't focus on that. We probably should more, given the numbers that I mentioned earlier that the United Nations projects. We're clearly heading to a global population of some 10 billion by 2050. We better figure out how we're going to manage with that. That is, given present technology, can the world really sustain 10 billion people? So, yeah, that's the heart of it, I think.
Okay.
I would say the first place in the world, I think, or the first place in literature that describes carrying capacity as a concept is in the book of Genesis. When Abraham and Lot are fighting, their herders are fighting over the amount of land. And I think that's the key point here, because for the most part, when we talk about a carrying capacity, and I think a lot about it, I'm working on a major project, but it's really a top-down thing that decision makers make. And it's not something which is going to motivate a family to reduce their rates. So I think we have to actually think about decoupling it. I'm deeply concerned about carrying capacity and exceeding carrying capacity. But unless you can translate it into a way that a herder says, listen, if we have more sheep, we'll have a tragedy of the common situation, and the vegetation is going to collapse. Unless you can show what's in it for them, that's not going to be that compelling. So I think that what we're saying is, yes, these concepts matter, but let's be pragmatic and let's be positive to find ways to translate these into ways that matter for people.
Okay, thanks. Here's an interesting, provocative question, I would say. I'll start with Dorit and Alon on this. I've heard before that the overpopulation argument is inherently racist, as countries that are overpopulated are largely minorities. Do you find any of this to be racist, or how would you react to claims?
Do you want me to take it, Dorit? This is something which I face all the time. Look, the truth of the matter is, if we look historically, one of the most tragic times, I think, for global sustainability discussions was the 1994 Cairo conference, where somehow or other this issue was hijacked. So we just talked about it a few times about in the late 1960s, when I was a child, overpopulation was at the core of the environmental agenda. But somehow sort of an unholy alliance, and if there's a wonderful article I would refer people to called by Diana Cool, who's a political scientist from the University of London, called Too Many Bodies, but basically some sort of a connection between the Vatican and some developing countries and actually the feminist movement did some population shaming. And I just want to say, first of all, Israel is a very white country and we have way too many children. And there are many places which face high population density. And by trying to pan this off as, oh, you're just a bunch of racists and this is just some, is really doing a disservice to the people who are going to suffer. 100 million people died of hunger during the last years. And yes, most of them had dark skins. But by saying we can't talk about it because that's there, I don't think we're helping them at all. So those people try to frame environmentalists as eugenicists, I think do a disservice, and I think it's highly disingenuous. Let's be colorblind and talk about what this planet can sustain.
And also, it's about empowering people. It's empowering women. It's empowering children. It's offering them better lives. So I don't think it's racist. I think it's also people in Israel. It's very obvious that whenever you talk about population or issues of how many children you're going to have, they blame you as someone who hates people. And I think it's coming from exactly the opposite. We love people. We love humanity. We want them to have better lives, and to everyone, for everyone to have better lives. So it's quite the opposite.
And I think maybe that's why. I mean, I think Alon mentioned that in the early days of what I would call the modern environmental movement since the 1960s, for the 60s and 70s, you heard a lot of, Paul Ehrlich and other people, you heard a lot about population. And then I would say to a large degree that sort of disappeared. And I think it's because of these kinds of sensitivities, but certainly it relates to all issues of sustainability.
It relates as well, if I'm still on. The population is births minus deaths plus any immigration. And in the United States, the controversial part that starts raising all those questions of racism is immigration. As the U.S. natural birth rate goes down, immigration plays a more visible role. And it's been very obvious in this country, more so I think in most around the world, that people start thinking about isn't just numbers of people, it's who is coming in. And in this country, in the Trump administration, was an enormous reaction to not just illegal immigration on the southern border wall that's being built, but to any immigration, because people are thinking in racial terms, and the White House has clearly not helped on that. But I agree with Alon and Dorit, which is it should be irrespective of where people are and what their color is, that everybody wants a better life, and pointing to ways they can make personal choices that lead to a better life on a finite earth works everywhere, because it's their choice. It's not something the United States or developed countries are forcing on other countries. I think we're past those days where the US is telling other countries what they ought to do to reduce the population. That's what's good about this paper, is the focus should be on what individuals can choose to do to help themselves. And each country makes its own decision.
I like the emphasis on individual choices and getting people at least to think about what their own well-being means and what it means for society, and making connections among those. And there are a lot of positive connections, so I think that's appealing. We have like 1 more minute, and let me just ask Dorit and Alon what you plan to do next with this work. Are you working on a larger project, or where are you headed on this?
Well, the truth of the matter is that because we're in a policy forum, we should really say that this approach is so important, because I don't know of any democratic country who's going to start adopting China's one-child policy. If we are going to do it, it's going to be through nudges and by sending messages out to the public. And so I chair an organization called CEP, the Israel Forum for Population and Environment. And we are going to start a campaign where we're going to try to take some of these insights and bring them to the public in a way. And it's going to make a lot of people angry, because a lot of religious people have deep feeling convictions that more children is necessarily better. But if you're really talking about being constructive in a policy realm, you have to offer people an alternative. Dorit, why don't you wrap it up?
Yeah, and for me, I want to develop educational programs for children in school, because for them it's not too late. Because for older people who've already done their choices, it's like good theoretically, but not practically. So.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, we are out of time. We have some other great questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to those, but we'll have to conclude here. So let me just mention that the Center for Environmental Policy is doing a big online conference celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Air Act on September 29th. So we'll make sure everybody gets more information about that. Some of you may already have that. And we're also initiating a series on climate adaptation. We'll have a very international orientation. So you'll hear more about that. So Alon, Dorit, and Michael, thank you. This is a great topic. When I thought it's time to sort of bring these issues to the fore, and it is an important issue in sustainability, but it needs to be discussed ethically and responsibly, and I think you are doing that. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I appreciate all the folks that signed on today. This was recorded, and it will be available once we go through a few requirements on the Center for Environmental Policy website. So for everybody in the US, good afternoon. For those of you in Israel, good evening. And we hope to see you again at future events. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.